Close your eyes for a moment. No, actually do it. Close your eyes. Now imagine you are standing on a glacier. It is minus 30 degrees. Your body stopped shaking an hour ago, which means it has given up trying to stay warm. Your boots are frozen solid. You have not eaten in 2 days. The man ahead of you stumbled and fell an hour ago and has not spoken since. The man behind you is whispering prayers in a language you no longer understand. And then you feel it. Presence. Calm. Steady. Almost warm. Something or someone right beside you. You do not turn around, because deep down some part of you already knows. There is nobody there. And yet, that presence is the reason you take the next step. And the next. And the next. Until somehow you are alive. Welcome. Today we are going somewhere most scientists did not want to go for a very long time. We are following the most extreme survivors in human history into the exact moment they met something that should not exist. And then we are cracking open the biology, the neuroscience, and the evolutionary logic that explains every single detail of what they experienced. This is the third man factor. And by the end of this video, you will never look at your own mind the same way again. Before we go further, drop a comment right now. Have you ever felt a presence during a moment of extreme fear, exhaustion, or isolation? You do not have to explain it. Just yes or no. We will come back to why your answer matters more than you think. The year is 1916. Ernest Shackleton and 2 of his men, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, are crossing the unmapped interior of South Georgia Island. Their ship, the Endurance, has been crushed by pack ice. Their 22 other crew members are stranded on a desolate island behind them, surviving in upturned lifeboats, waiting for a rescue that may never come. Shackleton's team has no proper equipment for mountain traversal. They have a carpenter's adze, 50 feet of rope, and 3 days of food. The crossing should take days. It takes 36 hours of continuous movement across glaciers and ridgelines in complete darkness. And then, at some point during that crossing, all 3 men, independently without discussing it with each other, become certain of the same thing. There is a 4th man walking with them. Not one of them saw a figure. Not one of them heard footsteps. But all 3 felt an unmistakable presence beside them. Calm, authoritative, and somehow guiding. It was only after they had reached safety, warmed themselves, and sat quietly together that Shackleton finally spoke first. He said he had the sense that there had been another presence on that traverse. Worsley and Crean looked at each other. They had both felt it too. None of them had wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Shackleton later wrote about it, cautiously, as men of his era often did about things they could not explain, and his account became the origin point of what researchers would eventually call the third man factor. It was not just Shackleton. Once his account was published, the floodgates opened. Mountaineers, polar explorers, shipwreck survivors, solo sailors, and disaster victims began coming forward with their own accounts. And what they described had a remarkable consistency. The presence was never threatening. It was never a ghost in the classical sense. No chains, no horror, no otherworldly visuals. It appeared specifically during what researchers now call the critical window, the period of total physical and psychological depletion where the body has nearly nothing left to give and the conscious mind is on the edge of shutting down. Spoke sometimes, usually in a calm, directive voice. It encouraged. It gave specific instructions. In several documented cases, it physically intervened. A hand on a shoulder, a firm push in the right direction. And when the crisis passed, when the survivor reached warmth, food, safety, the presence dissolved. Not gradually, instantly, as though it had only ever existed for one purpose. British author John Geiger spent years cataloging these accounts. His 2009 book on the subject documented over 100 cases. And the pattern that emerged was impossible to dismiss. The third man almost always arrived during the overlap of 3 simultaneous conditions. Extreme physical depletion, meaning the body's glucose and oxygen reserves are critically low. Complete social isolation, meaning the person believes they are alone or that their companions can no longer help, and a survival imperative, meaning there is still a concrete action that could lead to survival, but the person is losing the will to take it. Remove any one of those three conditions, and the accounts become far rarer. Combine all three, and something that science spent decades ignoring turns out to be one of the most consistent, reproducible phenomena in extreme human experience. For most of the 20th century, the third man was filed under folklore, hallucination, or spirituality, and left there. It was not that scientists thought it was unimportant. They thought it was unanswerable. That changed when neuroscientists started mapping a small region of the brain called the temporoparietal junction, the TPJ. The TPJ sits at the intersection of the temporal and parietal lobes, roughly above and behind your ear. Its primary function is spatial self-modeling. It is the region of your brain that constantly tracks the difference between where you are in space and where everything else is. It is, in a very literal sense, your brain's sense of self-location. Under normal conditions, the TPJ processes two streams of information and keeps them cleanly separated. Your own body's proprioceptive signals, the feedback from your muscles, joints, and vestibular system, and the brain's model of the external world. You are here. Everything else is there. The boundary is clear. But under extreme oxidative stress, which is what happens when your brain is starved of glucose and oxygen simultaneously, the TPJ begins to malfunction. In a landmark series of experiments, Swiss neurologist Olaf Blanke demonstrated something extraordinary. By applying mild electrical stimulation to the TPJ in conscious patients, he was able to reliably induce a sense of presence. The distinct, vivid feeling that another person was standing just behind them or beside them. The patients knew intellectually that nobody was there, but the felt sense was undeniable. One patient described it as a shadow. Another said it felt like a person who was doing exactly what they were doing, like a mirror that had fallen slightly out of sync. Blanke's conclusion was careful but clear. The sense of presence is not mystical. It is what happens when the TPJ loses the ability to properly localize the self, and the brain misattributes its own internal motor and proprioceptive signals to an external agent. In plain language, your brain creates a ghost out of its own data. It loses track of which signals belong to you, and assigns the remainder to someone else standing beside you. The second mechanism is metabolic. And this one is, in some ways, even more stunning. Under conditions of severe energy depletion, the brain undergoes a triage. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational planning, self-awareness, and abstract thought, is expensive to run. It requires a disproportionate share of the brain's glucose budget. When that budget collapses, the prefrontal cortex is one of the first regions to lose fuel. What this means in practice is that the brain's internal voice, the running commentary, the self-talk that guides your decisions, begins to lose its clearly self-referential character. In normal cognition, you know your own thoughts are yours. They feel like they originate inside you. In severe depletion, that ownership signal degrades. And when a thought loses its ownership tag, when your brain generates the instruction keep moving but fails to label it as your own, it becomes perceived as external, as a voice, as guidance from outside. This is not a metaphor. This is a known failure mode of the default mode network under conditions of hypoglycemia and hypoxia. The brain does not stop talking to itself. It just forgets who is talking. There is a third layer, and this one goes back to something older than language. Researchers studying social buffering, the well-documented phenomenon where the presence of another person significantly reduces cortisol output and physiological stress response, made a discovery that reframes everything. Social buffering does not require an actual person. It requires the brain's perception of a social presence. Studies in both human and animal subjects have shown that a represented social companion, one that is imagined or implied, produces measurable cortisol reduction. The amygdala calms, the heart rate stabilizes, the subjective sense of unbearable threat decreases. The third man is, among other things, a cortisol suppressor. The brain, pushed to the absolute limit of its survival capacity, generates a companion because a companion, even a phantom one, makes the body physiologically more capable of surviving. This is not a bug. This is a deeply engineered feature. I want you to pause here and actually think about this. Your brain will invent a person to save your life. Does that change how you think about the nature of companionship? About loneliness? Comment below, I read every single one. Homo sapiens did not survive the Pleistocene because we were fast. We were not. We did not survive because we were strong. We were not that either. We survived because we were social, radically, obsessively, almost pathologically social compared to every other apex predator. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, being separated from your group was not uncomfortable. It was fatal. A human alone on the African savanna was a meal. A human in a group of 30 was a formidable entity. The difference between isolation and community was the difference between death and survival. The result of hundreds of thousands of years of this selection pressure is a brain that treats social connection as a biological necessity. Not a preference, not a luxury, but something ranked alongside food, water, and warmth in the hierarchy of survival needs. Social pain, the ache of loneliness, exclusion, abandonment, activates the same neural circuitry as physical pain. Isolation does not just make you sad. It makes you sick. It elevates cortisol, suppresses immune function, accelerates cellular aging, and in prolonged cases, degrades cognitive function in measurable, structural ways. A brain that evolved in this environment did not develop an emergency protocol for starvation and forget to include one for isolation. Of course it did not. Isolation is just as lethal. The third man is the isolation protocol. Here is how the argument runs, and it is elegant in the way the best evolutionary arguments always are. An individual in a terminal survival situation who gives up dies. An individual who continues to act, even marginally, even irrationally, has a non-zero chance of survival. Anything that increases the probability of continued action in that situation is, over evolutionary time, selected for. Social presence is one of the most powerful motivators of continued action that the human brain possesses. We do things for others that we would not do for ourselves. We endure things in front of witnesses that we would not endure alone. The presence of a companion does not just reduce cortisol, it reframes the meaning of suffering. Suffering alongside someone is categorically different from suffering alone. A brain that can generate a phantom companion during lethal isolation, and generate one convincingly enough that the body responds as though it is real, has an enormous survival advantage over a brain that cannot. That is the evolutionary logic. The third man is not a malfunction. It is a backup system, a guardian protocol coded into the architecture of the social brain, lying dormant until the moment it is needed most. Here is a fascinating parallel that nobody was talking about 20 years ago, but that has become unavoidable. The explosion of AI companion technology, applications designed to provide social interaction, emotional attunement, and conversational presence, is not a coincidence. It is the commercial exploitation of the same neural architecture that produces the third man. Studies of elderly individuals living in isolation have shown that consistent interaction with AI companions produces measurable reductions in cortisol and self-reported loneliness that are statistically similar to the reductions produced by human contact. The brain, in those contexts, is doing something structurally analogous to what it does on the Glacier. It is generating the experience of social presence from a signal that is not, technically, another human being. What does that tell us? It tells us that the brain's social circuitry does not strictly require a real human being to function. It requires a convincing representation of one. And it has been capable of generating that representation internally, from its own resources, for as long as we have been human. This one is genuinely philosophical, and I want your real answer. If your brain generates a presence that saves your life, was it real? Does reality require an external source? Or is an experience real if it is functionally real? I am not fishing for a specific answer. I want to know what you actually think. One of the most important developments in third man research over the past decade is the mapping of non-extreme triggers. The original accounts came from mountaineers and polar explorers. But researchers began to notice that the sense of presence also appeared in far less dramatic contexts. And the pattern that emerged pointed to a specific triad of conditions that researchers have informally labeled Factor S. Factor S involves three co-occurring elements. First, sustained boredom or monotony, a prolonged state of reduced external stimulation that causes the brain to turn inward. Second, social isolation or deprivation, the removal of meaningful human contact over an extended period. Third, an underlying low-grade stress load, chronic cortisol elevation that does not reach acute crisis levels, but keeps the system in a state of low-level dysregulation. You do not have to be on a glacier for Factor S to activate. Long-distance truck drivers have reported it on empty night highways. Night shift workers in isolated industrial settings have reported it. Individuals in solitary confinement report it with striking consistency. Grieving people living alone report it. Factor S appears to lower the threshold for the sense of presence. The brain does not need to be at death's door. It needs to be starved of the social stimulation it is built to expect, and under enough background pressure that the compensatory system begins to activate. Some of the most controlled and rigorous data on the third man phenomenon now comes from long-duration spaceflight simulations. Agencies running isolation studies, where small crews are confined in sealed habitat modules for months at a time to simulate deep space missions, have begun systematic collection of presence reports. In simulation data from 2025 and early 2026, a consistent finding has emerged. The frequency of sense of presence episodes increases significantly after approximately 60 days of confinement, spikes at around 90 days, and then either stabilizes or, in subjects with strong pre-existing social networks and support structures, begins to decline as the brain appears to adapt. Critically, the presence reports are not correlated with psychological instability. They do not predict breakdown. In fact, subjects who reported the most vivid presence experiences during the mid-simulation period showed among the best performance metrics afterward. The brain's compensatory social generation appears to be working exactly as designed. What the space data also reveals is predictability. With sufficient biometric data, cortisol levels, sleep architecture, heart rate variability, and self-reported isolation scores, researchers can now predict with meaningful accuracy when a given individual is entering the window of highest susceptibility to a presence experience. The phenomenon, once considered mystical, has a measurable biological signature. Modern solo adventurers, particularly those attempting long-distance ocean crossings and high-altitude solo ascents, have become some of the most data-rich subjects in the history of third-man research. Many now wear continuous biometric trackers that log physiological data in real time. Several solo sailors who have completed transoceanic crossings in the past 3 years have reported presence experiences that were later mapped against their biometric logs. In almost every documented case, the onset of a presence experience correlated with a specific physiological signature: a marked drop in heart rate variability indicating high vagal stress, a decline in overnight sleep quality below a critical threshold, and a spike in movement irregularity suggesting gait-level fatigue. In other words, the body announces through its data that the brain is approaching the window where it will need its invisible ally. The presence is not random. It is not mystical. It is timed to a need. Real question for you: if you were going on a solo extreme expedition and you knew this was coming, would you want to prevent it? Or would knowing your brain can do this actually make you feel safer? Think carefully before you answer, because I think your answer reveals something real about how you relate to the unknown. Science has now mapped the mechanism with remarkable precision. We know the neural substrate, the temporoparietal junction, misfiring under oxidative stress. We know the metabolic pathway, the default mode network losing its ownership signal under hypoglycemia. We know the evolutionary logic, social buffering as a survival imperative. We have biometric predictors. We have simulation data. We have a century of consistent survivor accounts. And yet, there is a question that the mechanism does not answer. And it is the most important question. How does the presence know? Pause button, let that settle. In multiple documented cases, the third man provided specific, accurate, actionable guidance that the survivor had no obvious way of knowing consciously. A mountaineer told to stop, who stopped, and discovered a concealed crevasse directly ahead. A sailor directed to check a specific part of the rigging, who found a critical failure developing exactly there. Shackleton and his men directed along a route that turned out to be the only traversable path through terrain neither they nor their phantom guide had mapped. A strict mechanistic account says, the brain, operating below the level of conscious awareness, was processing information that the exhausted conscious mind had missed. The subconscious saw the crack in the ice. The subconscious detected the fraying rope. The subconscious calculated the gradient. And it delivered those conclusions to awareness through the only delivery mechanism that still had bandwidth, the phantom presence. That is a coherent explanation. It is also, when you think about it carefully, staggering. It means that somewhere beneath the threshold of your conscious access, you are processing the world at a depth and precision that you cannot normally hear. The third man is not bringing information from outside you. It is bringing information from inside you that you did not know you had. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated. And I do not say this to be provocative. I say it because this is where serious researchers, philosophers of mind, and cognitive scientists actually disagree. If the brain generates a presence that is functionally indistinguishable from an external guide, if it provides accurate information, appropriate comfort, and life-saving direction, at what point does the distinction between internally generated and externally sourced become meaningful? We draw a confident line between real and hallucinated. But that line assumes we have reliable access to what is real. The same brain that generates the third man is the brain that constructs your entire model of reality, every moment of every day. The boundary between self and world, between inner and outer, between imagination and perception, that boundary is always being constructed by the very organ in question. I am not saying the third man is supernatural. I am saying that the question of what counts as real is considerably more complicated than the word hallucination makes it sound. And the most honest scientists working in this space will tell you the same thing. Practically speaking, understanding the third man is beginning to reshape how we train extreme performers. Military special forces, high-altitude rescue teams, space agency psychologists, and deep-sea exploration crews are all now incorporating third-man awareness into their preparation frameworks. The goal is not to prevent the experience. The goal is to remove the terror from it. Because one of the most dangerous aspects of the third-man phenomenon historically was this. Survivors would feel the presence, realize they were hallucinating, panic, and destabilize at the exact moment when they most needed to stay focused. Teaching people in advance that this experience is a sign of a working brain, not a broken one, that it is a feature, not a malfunction, not evidence of madness, has measurably improved outcomes in high-risk contexts. Knowing that your brain has this in reserve does not make you weaker. It makes you less afraid of the moments when you are closest to the edge. Let me tell you something that I think is the most quietly remarkable conclusion of everything we have covered today. The human brain, at the absolute limit of its survival capacity, does not shut down. It does not despair. It does not give up. It builds a friend. It reaches into its own architecture, its memories, its social modeling systems, its sense of self, its deep evolutionary inheritance, and it assembles a companion. Calm, steady, pointing the way home. It does this not because you asked it to, not because you knew it could, but because somewhere in the long history of what it means to be a human being, the solitary animal that walks uphill in the dark until it either lives or dies, somewhere in that history, connection turned out to be more powerful than any individual will. The third man is not a ghost. It is not a hallucination in the dismissive sense of that word. It is your brain, at the end of everything, choosing not to let you face it alone. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things science has ever found. Now I want to hear from you. And I mean that in the most specific way possible. Tell me in the comments. Do you think the third man is purely biological, a spectacular but entirely mechanical feature of the survival brain? Or do you think there is something else happening, something that the mechanism describes but does not fully contain? There is no wrong answer here. This is a place where your philosophy, your experience, and your view of consciousness actually matter. I read every comment on this channel. Tell me what you actually think. If this video shifted something in how you see your own mind, share it with one person. Not for the algorithm, for the person in your life who has ever felt alone in a hard moment and not been able to explain it.